Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome a new contributor to this episode. His name is Isaiah Menning. Isaiah, since we're meeting you for the first time, first of all, congratulations and welcome to the show, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the External Affairs Director at American Conservation Coalition. ACC is a conservative environmental organization that is building a grassroots movement behind applying conservative and limited government ideas to environmental challenges. We think that government is oftentimes the problem in addressing our environmental challenges, whether that's conservation or energy needs. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about my article.
Okay, we're looking at an article of yours from realclearenergy.org. The title is Trump's Energy Czar can unleash energy dominance with carbon capture. Okay, I've been watching a lot of the different appointments under the Trump administration, and actually I've been very encouraged by most of them. I was not paying as close attention to his energy czar. What can you tell me about this individual and what that position entails?
Sure. So the energy czar is Doug Burgum, the former governor of North Dakota. Doug Burgum's official title is Secretary of the Department of Energy, but he also is chair of the National Energy Dominance Council. And Governor Burgum, while he was governor of North Dakota, advanced a clearly all of the above energy agenda, where he wasn't out to demonize fossil fuels or other types of energy sources. Rather, he wanted to accelerate innovation with that type of energy. And so in this article, I'm talking more about how he can particularly use his powers in the federal government to streamline processes for things like carbon capture as a part of the energy dominance agenda.
Okay, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of a definition on carbon capture. I can imagine what it might be, but I don't know for sure what it actually is.
Sure. So if you imagine a coal plant providing reliable electricity, it produces lots of byproduct, right? And some of that is carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide, it will either go into the atmosphere or you can capture it and put it in the ground or to some type of use. And so carbon capture is simply the process of taking that carbon dioxide off of a coal plant and then either permanently storing it underground or using it for some other type of use. And so that can range from putting it into a greenhouse to grow plants and food, or even using it to produce more energy like oil and gas.
Wow. I've got to be honest, we haven't heard so much about this. And I mean, I don't mean to just denigrate, the Biden administration, but it seemed like most of their focus was on, as you had mentioned, demonizing fossil fuels and, oil and gas is bad. We need to do everything we can to shut it down and move toward green energy. I had no idea that there were efforts like this going on. And as governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum is not exactly, he's not a granola type, or at least I wouldn't think of him as a granola type, from the way he governed.
Not at all. I think that Doug Burgum understands that the true conservationists are the hunters and ranchers and farmers in this country, and that we don't need to demonize a particular energy source. If we let the market do its thing, it will innovate new ways to use what would be a pollutant or something that might harm our environment for something that we can use for good. And so, yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. To go into a little bit as to what Governor Burgum did while he was governor of North Dakota, he said, this carbon capture is a great opportunity for us to both steward our environment and remove a gas that could harm it and use it for a positive good. And so what he did was he took steps to streamline the permitting process. He worked for the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that is, to get primacy to permit carbon capture wells within the state. That is, usually the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, is the one who's permitting these kinds of wells. He said, hey, we can do this in North Dakota. And so they did. And now they can approve wells much more quickly and do things that are good for the economy with the carbon dioxide.
How cumbersome was that process before he streamlined it?
It takes a while. Environmental review can take years sometimes, and that can increase drastically the cost of some kind of process. And so, ironically, environmental laws are oftentimes the things that are the biggest barriers to deployment of clean energy resources. We know that the environmental impact statements, which you oftentimes need to build something like a carbon capture pipeline, take on average 4.5 years to complete. Bringing some of those processes back to the state level is a great way to allow state managers who know their state the best the tools they need to permit permit new projects, and then to also take into account the particular issues in their own area. And so this was a major step that really helped streamline that process.
So Isaiah, would this facilitate greater oil and gas exploration in those states where there is, an energy harvesting sector? I know not every state does this, but will this make it easier for them to do energy exploration?
Right. Absolutely. That's the amazing thing about carbon capture that many people don't realize is that carbon capture can help a process called enhanced oil recovery, where you can take carbon dioxide that would just otherwise go into the atmosphere and you can pump it into the ground to actually extract more oil and gas. In that way, you can actually put in more carbon dioxide into the ground than you take out with the oil and gas, effectively creating carbon neutral oil and gas that wouldn't have been taken out of the ground in the first place. And so this is really an example of how drilled baby drill can actually be quite good for the environment if we have the right tools to use the resources at our hands in order to develop new resources like oil and gas.
I mean, on the one hand, I'm wondering, why haven't we heard more about this? On the other hand, as you're describing this, this would take some of the wind out of the sails of the more extreme environmental movements and climate alarmists that, want to clamp down on everything that isn't green energy.
And that's the thing. We have former Vice President Al Gore, right? One of the maybe the biggest proponents of climate alarmism that we've seen. He's a big critic of carbon capture generally. He says that it's kind of a fraud, and you have other people on the environmental left that are a major critic of this. When the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the biggest authority on this issue, says that we need carbon capture in order to steward our environment. This is the source that they usually cite for their concerns, and so it just goes to show that oftentimes you have myopic thinking where people really can't see beyond ending fossil fuels in order to address an issue like climate. And if using carbon capture to produce more fossil fuels is the result, and they don't want to see it, even if it's reducing emissions, which carbon capture can certainly do.
No, you're telling me some pretty strong selling points for why this should be the norm. So let me ask you this. What kind of pushback or what kind of resistance is Doug Burgum facing in implementing this streamlining at the federal level?
I think that we'll see lots of environmental groups more on the left to come out against a kind of a measure that would take major action to do this. And the reality is, and Interior Secretary Burgum has really identified this, is that as Secretary of the Interior, he has administrative powers over the hundreds of millions of acres that belong to the public of the United States, our public lands. And he says these lands are valuable and they're part of our balance sheet. We should be able to use them to produce resources and to advance American interests. And so if he took steps to open up offshore areas to carbon capture or enhanced oil recovery, he might see pushback from groups in the environmental left, which is why groups like ACC supporting action like that is really important to show that we can have energy dominance and environmental stewardship at the same time. And so there's a really great opportunity here to use our federal lands and our federal waters to produce more energy and reduce emissions at the same time, because producing more American energy is good for our climate and the planet.
So I want to be optimistic because what you're describing to me it's reason for optimism. Is this something that could be easily undone by another administration, assuming that the Trump administration effectively gets this in place during the 4 years it's in office?
It's a great question. I'd like to think that administrative actions that this administration takes on energy dominance and on things like carbon capture will be so good that a future administration wouldn't want to take that away. We've seen that with a number of things where policies that Trump had put in were not undone by Biden if they produced the kinds of effects that everyone wanted. And so this is a great opportunity as Republicans have a trifecta to potentially consider what kind of policy we might be able to do to advance energy dominance and to do it in such a way that we wouldn't want to undo it. Now, there's definitely opportunity to do carbon capture work and energy dominance work in the legislature. It's absolutely necessary. But for now, we can make policy that's really good at the federal level, and that will be resilient in and of itself.
Man, I'm so happy to learn about this. Again, we're talking with Isaiah Menning. He's the External Affairs Manager at American Conservation Coalition and a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media?
Sure. So the best place to find me on social media is just Isaiah Menning on X.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Agustina Vergara Cid back to the program. This is not your first time on the show, but for people who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me again, Brian. Well, like you said, I'm Agustina. I specialize in immigration policy, and I try to write and speak about it with kind of like an informed philosophical perspective.
Well, there have been some big changes in immigration policy since the Trump administration took office back in January. And one of the things that I've heard a little bit about, but I have to admit, I'm not well informed on the gold card that is part of the immigration reforms being brought about by the Trump administration. What can you tell me about this gold card, and who does it benefit and how does it work?
So the gold card is a new type of path to permanent residency that the Trump administration is implementing. It's not citizenship, but it allows someone to come here to America and live and work legally without restriction. So the Trump administration, the details are a little fuzzy still about this new program. I don't know exactly, we still don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but apparently they're launching it very soon. But when this was pitched about like a month ago, it was pitched as a replacement for the current investor visa. The current investor visa has people investing between $800,000 and $1.5 million to be able to come, among other things that they have to do, to be able to come to America and work legally on an American business. I mean, they can invest in a company or they can start a business. So the gold card would allegedly replace that system with this new, way more streamlined way of obtaining permanent residency, and eventually it would potentially lead to citizenship as well for those who want to apply. Now, the price tag for the gold card is $5 million, so it's much more expensive than the investor visa.
Maybe they're just taking inflation into account. I'm kidding. That's a joke. But okay. So my first reaction is, well, on the one hand, we would want investors to come here and to work here because they're probably bringing with them ideas or products or opportunities that will actually, cause opportunities for employment or products that people need to use. This is all good. In other words, I think they're being productive and helping improve people's lives. On the other hand, boy, there are a lot of people who have waited and paid so much money over the years trying to navigate what you refer to in your article as a Kafkaesque immigration system, and it just seems like, well, with enough money, you can just kind of cut ahead in line. That almost makes me want to say, is that fair to do that? Is it a good idea to make that opportunity available?
I think that our immigration system really is Kafkaesque, and it doesn't just need mere reform, it needs to be completely rethought, and we need to start from scratch with the immigration system. Now, that is unfortunately not going to happen anytime soon. So I think that small steps to make the system a little bit more straightforward and to streamline it are really good. Now, like you said, that $5 million price tag is extremely steep for the vast majority of people. But I do think that if the price tag is reduced and is adjusted for, there are so many ways to adjust it. I mentioned some of them in my article. You can adjust the price for level of education, age, and generally you can have potential immigrants prove their income to how much they can pay. I think that would actually bring a little bit more freedom to the system and, avoid a lot of suffering of people that have to go through the system, and some of them never even actually get to get their permanent residency. And I think that having a system like that would actually help with some of our problems that we experience right now due to how restrictive the immigration system is. It could actually help fix the border crisis that so many people are concerned about by having those migrants who right now don't have any way of coming here legally, by having them pay the money that they're actually right now paying to the cartels because of this immigration black market, just pay it to the government and come here safely, legally, and they can be thoroughly vetted so we can avoid any sort of danger from gang members and people like that.
No, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned this is not buying a person's citizenship, but it helps to provide a path to citizenship. And I'm just curious, does this streamline the process for becoming a naturalized citizen at some point?
So the process for becoming a naturalized citizen, I think right now it's not that is not the difficult part of the immigration process. It's a little bit bureaucratic, but it's not the part I think that would be priority to overhaul. I think just getting here legally, getting to work and build and produce legally here, I think that's the main obstacle, unfortunately.
Okay. I just, I welcome people coming here. I believe there is enough opportunity for anyone who wants to come here and work and, pursue their dreams. Is there a way that the person who puts up, let's just say someone has that $5 million to put up, is there a way for them to get back that money after a certain amount of time? Or is that just the price for entry, as a resident?
No, that is just the price for entry as a resident, as I understand, as the Trump administration pitched it. You pay it, you don't get it back ever. It's not an investment, like a monetary investment. You just pay the price. And of course, like I said, that makes it even less attractive for a lot of people that don't have that money. So if this replaces the investor visa, that will mean that it's actually a way to reduce legal immigration, because if you do away with investor visa, which grants about 10,000 visas a year, and you replace it with this one, well, not entirely sure, despite what the administration says, the 10,000 people are going to want to come here, right? But paying $5 million. No, it's not that they don't want to come here, it's just that they probably can't afford it. So unless the price tag changes, this would be actually a way of reducing legal immigration, which is definitely not something that I think should happen here.
So would the gold card also be limited to 10,000 people per year?
No, the gold card would be uncapped. So as many as they can sell, they will grant. But imagine if they had a different price tag, right? Imagine the people that would come, not just these mega millionaires, and not just people, who are desperate and are crossing the border and they pay $20,000 to a coyote to be able to cross. It's not just that people, but there would be people that, they don't come here now because the system is so restricted. We're talking doctors, engineers, nurses, all kinds of people that would be a great addition to society. And honestly, there's such shortages here. And it gives the opportunity of people to, build a life in America and, live up to the promise of the Declaration to pursue their happiness.
No, I see the wisdom in what you're talking about here, and also understand, scientists, doctors, engineers, while they may be specialized and they may be actually highly paid in their line of work, they're probably not sitting there with an extra $5 million in their pocket, just ready to spend. That's right. There. How would it benefit Americans here at home to continue to attract professionals and investors and otherwise, productive people to continue to immigrate to this nation?
Well, I think the benefits of immigration are like, we need a whole interview to discuss those. But I just usually tell people, can you imagine a world where we had 1 billion Americans, like Matthew Iglesias says, more people, more good people coming here, and these would be people that are not criminals. And there are people that if they commit a heinous crime, they could potentially be deported. We know that it's really good people that are coming here. They're vetted. Imagine having so many more Americans. The fact of being an American, America is such an incredible idea, and the people that want to come here want to assimilate and build on that idea and defend our freedom in many, many ways.
I appreciate your take on this. We're coming up. We got just about a minute left here. Is it likely that this gold card program will at least be the first step in other immigration reform? You mentioned the whole system needs to be overhauled. What's the next biggest thing that you see that needs to be addressed?
Well, part of what needs to be addressed is uncapping, because every visa and green card has a cap. I think uncapping those would be a good next step. Now, that said, based on what the administration is currently doing in the realm of immigration, I really don't think that's going to happen. I think the gold card is as much as we'll see in this administration if things continue to go in this direction. I do hope that President Trump realizes that he has this historical opportunity to, bring more Americans to Americans and create more Americans essentially out of thin air instead of, restricting their immigration here.
Again, we are talking with Agustina Vergara Cid. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Ryan.
And we are back. Welcoming another new contributor to Young Voices, I have Joseph T. McFadden joining me. He's a journalist and artist in Brooklyn, New York, and a contributor for Young Voices. And Joseph, I know we're just scratching the surface here, so take a moment and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, I am a journalist, a freelance journalist, and living in Brooklyn, New York. You know, I'm also a painter. You can look at my work on Instagram at joet.mcfadden, although that's not really what we're here to talk about. But you know, I write freelance. I've also written for the Daily Beast, Upward News, some other publications. And, you know, I write about the intersection of media, discourse, technology, you know, how are social technologies influencing how people talk to each other. And, you know, Gavin Newsom recently started a new podcast. You know, it's the age of podcasts. This was the podcast election. And he's really taking kind of the approach of the long form discussion across the aisle, which I think is kind of a format that is been long coming. And now he's finally jumped on board with that train and decided that he wants to get on board with reaching across the aisle to talk to conservatives and long form discussions. So, you know, I wrote an article about that. But I think given Gavin Newsom's, you know, way he does things, he's an operator. And so I think that the reason that he has decided to do this is because he sees it as an opportunity, a political opportunity to advance the Democrats and advance himself.
You know, his interview, or I think he have Charlie Kirk on as one of his first guests on his podcast.
It was his first, yeah. And his first guest was Charlie Kirk. Michelle Goldberg had a really interesting article about it in the New York Times, and she was saying, you know, that she thought Charlie Kirk was too demagogic for Newsom to be so nice to him. But I felt like he did push back a bit on conservative demagoguery around transgender, you know, people. And I felt like he kind of drew a fine line saying that, well, you know, Newsom thinks there's unfairness in transgender women being in, transgender women being in women's sports. And but being opposed to, as I said, the demagoguery around transgender people on the right. I do feel like he pushed back a little bit against Kirk. But, you know, the conversation was this sort of respectful, friendly tone that was pretty different than his debate he had with Ron DeSantis in sometime last year or the year before. It was much more heated. I mean, on Bill Maher's show last year, he attacked conservatives saying, you know, they're going after DEI, CRT, all these letters, ESG. They're shapeshifters. Well, Newsom is kind of a shapeshifter of his own. I mean, come on, you know, he's the used car salesman of governors. So I think he's adapting to the times. And I mean, he also sat down with Steve Bannon after his discussion with Kirk. I don't discuss it in the article. But he is pretty committed to talking to people right now who are really across the aisle from him. But I don't think he's necessarily changed his policy positions, because he defended the, you know, gender identity law in California that makes it so that, you know, the student needs to give their permission to the teacher in order to reveal their sexual orientation or gender identity to the parent. So, I mean, I don't actually know if he's changed his positions that much. I just think he's mostly changed his style.
That was actually the question I wanted to ask you was, you know, is this shift, is it just a strategic, you know, repositioning to appear, hey, I'm more, you know, middle of the road? We talked about this before we went on the air here about he has the ability to read the room. And clearly, by reading the room, he needed to adjust somewhat to be able to relate to the people in that room. But being a politician, I always have to wonder, and I would say the same thing of Mitt Romney. Is he just saying this because he thinks I want to hear this, or is this a sincere, you know, place he's coming from?
It's hard to tell. I mean, you know, politicians tend to operate. I mean, you know, I think that one of the things that maybe sets the Democrats apart from the Republicans a little bit, I've heard people say this who are familiar with Congress, is Democrats tend to have more true believers. But I think that Gavin Newsom is definitely a slick operator who's just doing what he needs to do to advance the Democratic agenda, to advance himself. You know, I'm pretty sure he's going to run for president in 2028. It really seems like he wants to. But you know, the way he describes his podcast, he talks about affordability, quality of life, and the cultural movements shaping our time as being the subject of his podcast. Well, God, that just screams voter pandering. I mean, that's exactly what the last election was about. Quality of life, affordability, and cultural movements like rejection of far left identity politics. I mean, That's exactly what this election was about. And I think that he's just parroting what he wants people to hear. Now, do I think that it's a good idea for him to do this strategically? Yeah, probably. But I also think that there is value in. I do think he has pushed back a little bit, but I mean, I didn't listen to his episode with Steve Bannon, but what I've heard other people say about it, he was pretty soft on him. I mean, Steve Bannon recently did the salute thing at CPAC, and let's be honest, he knew how people would receive that. I do not believe that that was intended to be a wave. I think it was intended to be a signal to the far right to be kind of like, you know, ha ha ha, look at that, look what we did. I did that, and people are going to say, oh, is it a Nazi salute? Is it not? I don't know if they talked about that in the discussion, but it sounds like that. I don't know. Maybe you see, I'm going back and forth a bit on, do I think he pushes back enough or not? But yeah, I mean, he's definitely a chameleon.
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm all in on the Trump train, but there was a pretty decisive shift in this last election. Trump may have been a good part of that, but as you mentioned, identity politics and particularly the segment of the American society that doesn't want to be lectured to or doesn't want to be, told, listen, you're wrong, you've always been wrong, and, as long as you don't agree with me, you're going to continue to be wrong. People were getting tired of that. And Gavin Newsom, to his credit, appears to be one of the politicians who recognizes that approach is not winning hearts or friends, so let's try something a little bit different. And can he win back some of those more middle-of-the-road voters?
That's just an interesting question. I mean, I think that the voters who, there was some early polling after the election that found that the swing voters who really turned the election toward Trump voted based on cultural issues. And those are people who maybe could be turned back around. I think Brookings did some research that found that Latino men, while they moved really radically toward Trump in the last election, they are still open to voting for Democrats and are not that against it. There are other Democrats who are talking about this, Ruben Callego from Arizona, Richie Torres from the Bronx, Fetterman. He did something really funny. The anti-Israel protesters were outside of his house, and he went onto the roof and waved an Israeli flag. So not exactly about people being lectured to, but I think you're right to say that he does realize that voters don't want to be lectured to about racism or gender or whatever when it's so obvious, to most scientists that there are two biological sexes. I was arguing with someone about this not long ago, who seemed unaware of the fact that transgender people can exist and biological sex also be dimorphic, and also intersex people are real too. It seems like the far left, which doesn't really represent most of the country, and I think still represent a pretty small minority of people, for some reason, their kind of pseudoscientific ideas became kind of popular, and people just don't want to be lectured to about them. And minorities don't either. And I think that it's possible for the Democratic Party to win back a lot of those minorities.
One of the things that you and I had talked about just before going on the air was the need for people to be able to talk with each other. When people reach the point where, I can't even talk to them, that's when you see the balkanization like we saw, 30 years ago in Eastern Europe. So I applaud those who are willing to have that conversation, even if they don't end up agreeing in the end, as long as people have the ability to talk and realize that, the person they're talking to is not necessarily part of this monolithic movement. It seems to me that there's hope that it doesn't have to become such a us or them mentality. We've got about a minute left. I would love any of your thoughts on, is Newsom's move likely to help tone down some of the fire, or is it just keeping it concealed?
It's a good question. Tone down some of the fire. I mean, I think that any politician who doesn't engage, in social media stunts and inflammatory, angry, shouting rhetoric is a good thing. I mean, he might be doing this because it's strategic for him to do, but simultaneously, I still think that there are benefits to it, and I hope that other people might imitate that. I think that one of the dangers is sort of permitting the shift in the Overton window to where, do we want people like Ian Carroll and what's that fascist's name, to come on Joe Rogan's podcast? Not really, no.
Again, we're talking with Joseph T. McFadden. Joseph, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome a new contributor. Her name is Lika Kobeshavidze. I hope I came close there, Lika, but I welcome you. Tell us just a little bit about yourself. We know you are a Young Voices contributor, but what is your background?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Lika. I'm 24 years old. I'm a Georgian political writer, a journalist, and currently a policy fellow at Young Voices Europe. I've reported on Eastern European affairs and democratic resilience for years. I finished Bachelor of International Relations back home in Georgia, and I'm currently finishing my master's degree in European Studies in Sweden, in Lund University. And I also did an exchange semester in Sorbonne University in France. And all of this was focused on European affairs, politics, and of course, democratic exciting, which I'm really interested in.
I'm looking at an article that you wrote for emergingeurope.com, Breaking the Soviet Shadow, Georgia's Fight for True Freedom. And I hear about Georgia from time to time, the former Soviet Republic, but I'll admit that I'm not up to speed on what the current state of that nation is. Talk to me a little bit about, I mean, it's been a while since the Soviet Union dissolved, but how has Georgia as a nation fared in the years since the Iron Curtain came down?
Of course. Well, it's been a huge journey for the country. And when you learn it from the history books, it's not as relatable as when you live in the country and you hear it from your parents, your friends, and you actually realize that the people before you lived through this very hurricane time. I wrote this piece because I've seen my generation inherit a country that gained independence from Soviet Union, but still hasn't achieved any sort of true freedom. And that gap between legal independence and, I would say, democratic reality is what I wanted to confront, I would say. And the article argues that Georgia's struggle today is not with Soviet tanks, but with Soviet legacy and tactics, which our current illegitimate government still tries to make in our country. They're basically inheriting everything and making it even worse. That was even during Soviet Union. So today, Georgia basically abandoned all of its progress, the developments, the democratic freedom we were aspiring to achieve in upcoming years by this time. And unfortunately, we are so far back into Russian troops in general, and understanding the fact that your own people are fighting against people my age and younger than me is very tragic, especially for me since I'm so far away from home. But at the same time, it makes me so proud that no matter what happens in my country, the will to be democratically free and achieve this freedom, and the understanding that you might leave house and never come back because you might be imprisoned or even worse. And I mean what I'm saying, it makes me a lot of proud that there are people who truly believe in our European freedom. And I'm completely sure that we will achieve it one way or another, but it will be even a bigger journey rather than defeating Soviet Union.
Lika, in your article, you talk about how under Soviet rule, it was more than just economic repression. When the Soviets ruled Georgia, it was an attack on national identity. Talk to me a little bit about the national identity of Georgia before it came under Soviet rule.
It's very interesting because, to be fair, our Georgian identity is very much connected to the constant understanding of resistance. We're in this constant cycle of resisting, of fighting, and basically it very much resonates with our identity. We know we have to protect our country because basically every empire ever existed throughout the history, they attacked and invaded Georgia at some point. So there were some that invaded Georgia several times throughout the history. So it's kind of invaded in our identity. But what Russia did is that our religious, our culture, even our language that we are so proud of and are one of the oldest ones, they did their best to erase it. At the end of 20th century, they also passed a law that they wanted to abolish Georgian language completely, and which is a huge understanding of our identity. It's very much embodied in it. Without Georgian language, Georgia would never exist. And this socialism system they tried to build basically meant that everything Russian was great, but everything outside of it was already negative and could be repressed. And unfortunately, before, even during Soviet Union, they could never make it work. But of course, it has a huge, even still, it has a huge mental impact on our people. But as I said, it's our resilience that is very much embodied with our identity. So we keep fighting, and we keep fighting for what is ours.
Talk to me a little bit about what took place in March of 2023 and again, in 2024 regarding the so-called foreign agent law. What was that law all about?
Well, foreign agent law is a very interesting concept, as our government says that it's U.S. law, which once existed against the Soviet Union, and also they label it as a French law, and they very much associated with the transparency. But unfortunately, it has nothing to do with the transparency, and it's very much a remake and even a worse version of the law that exists in Russia and in Belarus. In 2023, basically out of the blue, our government enforced this law, which was a huge shock. And it was one of the first time that we all got unbelievably mad and angry. It was very much a uniting experience at the same time that all of the Georgians, regardless their political views, we were protesting for weeks. And of course, we made our government take the law back, which was a huge win. And I still remember when we read the news that they were taking it back, I actually felt that we could defeat this regime. We could move forward, as our protest actually, for the first time, ever since I was a young teenager, I would say, we made it work. But unfortunately, in 2024, they brought it back. And even though Georgians fought unbelievably, we still face the consequences of this unfortunate law. Basically, this law means that the government can enforce any type of the law they want. They can finish and any type of non-governmental organization or free media. What is happening now to Belarus or Russia, that they're lethal to no independent media, and you have no objective information to what is happening even in your country. They're trying to do it today in Georgia, and they imprisoned so many people without any legal causes. And unfortunately, this is all tied to Russian law. Since this law exists, they can adopt any type of law they want, and there is no turning back.
Tell me just a little bit about where this love of freedom grew so strong, especially for this younger generation. We're seeing something very similar in Generation Z here in America, in that they are much more freedom-minded than the millennials who came before them. I'm curious, what sparked this in those young Georgians?
Yes, of course. So speaking from my perspective, as my generation is regarding a generation after we reached independence from 2000 and like developing world and everything, we are the people who experience life in Europe, life in US. We've seen it, we've traveled in it, and we know how nice it is to have a government who cares about you. At least you know that if you protest, it will have the consequences. The government will act, they will listen to you. And analyzing that it's so simple there, especially after living in Sweden, we know that we want life like that. We want to have simple elections, normal lifestyle, and to be able to change government whenever we feel like that they are not acting the way they promised to act before electing them. So this love to freedom is what we are envying in European countries. We don't want to be 19-year-olds and protesting for the simplest things, such as freedom, democracy, or fair elections that are such a usual thing in, for example, normal European countries. So I would say this is one of the main reasons. We've seen our parents fighting for it, and we don't want to go through the same thing. So we know that these times define it. We either win or we become next Belarus, unfortunately.
Once again, we are speaking with Lika Kobeshavidze. She is a Georgian political writer and also a Young Voices Europe contributor. Where can people find your work? Where can they follow you on social media, Lika?
I would say mostly on LinkedIn, since I have my portfolio over there. It's just my name and surname. But also, even if you Google me on Young Voices, there is a database of all of my articles. I've written through them, but also in other journals I'm working with there. Even if it's very simple, if you Google my name, it will be there.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to future conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.